In this episode, we will continue our discussion on the impacts of affirmative action with Dr. Raquel Wright-Mair and Dr. Gabriel Pulido. Follow us in this conversation as we discuss their research on spirit murdering in academia and its intersection with affirmative action.
This is The Hidden Critique, where we discuss art, race, and higher education at the intersection of an MFA. I'm Marlon Tobias, pronouns he, him.
And I'm Krystle and Marlon, pronouns she, her.
Welcome to our show.
So today we are in our third installment in our conversations regarding the affirmative action decision that was made last year in 2023. Today we have Dr. Raquel Wright-Mair and Dr. Gabriel Pulido to help round out and give their analysis in regards to this topic at hand.
All right, let's share their bios and give them a warm welcome.
Yes.
All right, so Dr. Wright-Mair conducts research that is grounded in social justice, equity, and inclusion in higher education. Her research agenda seeks to transform and advocate for the creation of more equitable and inclusive campus environments for underrepresented populations, specifically racially minoritized faculty members. She works collaboratively with the National Institute for Transformational and Equity as a faculty researcher, conducting work focused on cultivating supportive campus environments that maximize success among diverse population. Dr. Wright-Mair has produced several conference presentations and publications focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. She's also co-editor and contributing author for the book College Students and Their Environments, and is actively involved in several national organizations, including the American Education Research Association and the Association for Study of Higher Education. In addition, Dr. Wright-Mair serves on the editorial board of the Journal of Diversity in Higher Education and the Journal of Higher Education, Politics and Economics. Welcome, Dr. Wright-Mair.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Wonderful.
And Dr. Gabriel Pulido was born and raised in Sacramento, California, and first became involved with creative writing in the youth poetry slam scene. While an undergrad, Gabriel utilized classroom lessons to fuel his creative writing endeavors. Currently, he recently graduated in higher education with a double minor in African American and Diaspora Studies and Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. Gabriel considers himself to be a transdisciplinary scholar whose work often travels across multiple fields. Ultimately, Gabriel seeks to perform the work while honoring the rich histories and legacies that scholar activists have fought for. Presently, Gabriel has 3 lines of research commitments. 1, artistic performance and retention in higher education. 2, mentorship, rationality, and belonging. And 3, arts-based methodologies and activism in social science research. Gabriel's academic and creative writing often intersect and find a home at the center of healing. Gabriel considers himself a conjurer of joy, love, and resilience as he uses both creative and academic writing to work toward collective liberation. When not writing, Gabriel can be found near a body of water, dreaming of becoming just as free. All right. Well, thank you guys for coming on and sharing your takeaways as well as your expertise along with the subject matter. But before we get into the nitty gritty, we're all about mental health here at The Hidden Critique. And because mental health is important in life, especially when you're living the artist, entrepreneur, scholar lifestyle, I want to begin with just a simple question. How is your heart?
I appreciate that question, Marlon, and the attention to that question, because certainly for the work I do, I'm always encouraging folks to start from that place. My heart's in a good place today. I would say I am feeling and welcoming joy.
Love that. Love that. How about you, Gabriel? How's your heart?
It's also in a good place. I am very excited for the next couple of months, and yeah, I really can't complain. This year has been off to a great start, and I'm excited.
Nice,
Wonderful.
nice. Chris, tell us, how's your heart?
My heart is calm. I'm just trying to keeping this really calm vibe and, enjoy the steady work that I have to get done without being overwhelmed, and just keeping that vibe of calm and reflection throughout this year. And how about you, Marlon?
Full transparency, my heart is kind of frazzled.
Really?
I'm in a place where I have good problems, right? So my calendar is stacking and stacking and stacking and stacking and stacking.
All right.
My head seems to kind of be on a swivel lately, just making sure that I'm giving the proper amount of attention to all of my projects and my jobs, and also making sure that I'm positioning myself for future projects and future roles. So I'm kind of in a space of juggling right now, but I also sit in a place of gratitude because this is what I wanted, right? I wanted to have these opportunities available to me. So while I'm fighting to manage them, I'm also very grateful that I am in the place to be able to have these opportunities. So yeah,
that's beautiful. In starting this conversation, I've been so interested in conversations around looking at histories, how it connects with today, and how we can grow in these environments that we work, we do labor, and while focusing on these things that power us and we're passionate about. And I think so much of the work that we each do on this call intersects in that space where we're using these very passionate feelings we have about whether it is injustice or even the identities that we carry, and using creativity both in writing and visually to discuss these things, and really focusing on how life can be better. And starting there, I guess I want to introduce the conversation by asking, well, I would, is it okay if I call you Raquel in this conversation?
Absolutely. Please do, Chris.
Okay. Yes. Raquel, I know you are also a fellow Jamaican, and I'm so curious how your career started in specifically in these conversation, this topic that you focus so much on now, intersecting with how higher ed affects the individual that is, of color or of various identities.
That's a great question, Chris. I'll start by saying I was brought to this field very serendipitously. And in many ways, higher ed found me. I was on a track to be an attorney, which I think is a product of being Jamaican, right? So growing up.
That's a lion.
Yeah, right. There are only two choices I was given. You could be a medical doctor or a lawyer. Most of my friends are medical doctors and them attorneys. I very quickly became bored with law, and particularly the absoluteness of law. Absoluteness is not a word. So absolutism of law, right? And I should have known then that my questioning of life was actually leading me down a whole different path, right? And I remember, one of my favorite law professors, he taught torts, and I remember him saying, "Oh no, you're going to be an amazing lawyer, but you can't question the law." And I said, "What do you mean? Why can't you question the law?" And I would say that's me in a nutshell, right? I very quickly fell out of love with law. And my former RA had reached out to me randomly one day, inviting me to his school to give a talk about just my experiences at the time. He had a speaker fund and could give me, an honorarium to come and talk about a topic that he had interest in me sharing my experiences on. I accepted, went to the institution that weekend. I think I flew up to Chicago on a Friday, and on Sunday, I was filling out an application for grad school for a Master's of Higher Ed program that I was late for. The application, was already late, but he had just recently graduated and had great relationships with the program coordinators, et cetera, et cetera. Long and short of it, I got a fully funded GA that allowed me to do my master's. I then worked in student affairs for many, many years before deciding to move to Denver to do my PhD. So in many ways, I stumbled on this. I was very, very interested in justice work my entire life, from canteen boycotts in Jamaica to questioning the world. In many ways, I now look back and realize this was all purposefully orchestrated. And here I am.
Wow, that's beautiful. And to get you into this conversation as well, Gabriel, share with me a bit about your journey and then how it connects with Miss Raquel here.
Yeah,
that was also orchestrated, by the way.
Carefully crafted.
Definitely was. Yeah. I would say that the short answer is poetry. Poetry has been instrumental in my life ever since I was a youth in high school. It really was my way of expression. I felt like for the longest I didn't have access to my voice fully, and poetry was the first tool that I can recall where I felt I'm expressing myself and no one can really tell me that I'm doing it wrong, right? Because who else is going to tell you how you're feeling than your own heart? Poetry took me to a lot of places. I utilized it to travel the US. I utilized it in college. I utilized it when looking at master's programs. That was my only criteria. I wasn't looking at top programs. I said, do they have a poetry scene? And if so, then I want to go there. And so I ended up at an institution in Colorado, and it was not the best experience. And so I talked to the dean. The dean made my graduate position into a part-time position for a year. And then when that expired, I looked at the program again and I said, okay, well, 2 of the faculty are on sabbatical. There's a new faculty, Dr. Wright-Mair. And I said, I think it's a good time to re-enter. And I did. And then I think it was maybe week 2 or week 1 where Dr. Wright-Mair pulled me to the side, or we were talking, or I was talking to her, and she said, where are you going to do your PhD? And I still laugh about it because at the time I was like, you're crazy. Like, I'm here for my master's so I can go work. That was the purpose, right? To get access to be able to do the work of retention, because that was the whole inspiration for me to even look at higher ed. I wanted to do work like the director of the Chicano. It's called El Centro, right? But it doesn't matter for the purpose of this. But nonetheless, it was the Chicano Latino Research Center. And I wanted to do that work, and I never imagined a PhD. But after a year of knowing Dr. Wright-Mair and working closely with her as her GA, I somehow ended up applying to programs a year later, got into a couple, and then fast forward, and I graduated from one. So
now you are a doctor.
That's so beautiful.
That is genius recognizing genius and pouring into the genius. Stories like that I just love. When you're in this place where you're not expecting a mentor to totally change and elevate the trajectory of your life, and the stars align and just grace you with this blessing and this token to further affirm your place in this world, in the field that you're passionate about. So I love stories like that.
Absolutely.
Very much so.
Yeah. But let's get into this conversation, right? So you two actually collaborated on a publication that discusses spirit murdering, which is for me a very powerful yet very poignant term that I think really needs to be unpacked in regards to the subject of this affirmative action decision that impacted education. So I just want to kind of refer to that article that you guys collaborated in. And in your article, you defined spirit murdering as a direct outcome of racism, where the mind, body, souls, and spirits of racially minoritized people are destroyed by employing violent racist attacks on them. So for you guys, could you just give some examples of common forms of spirit murdering in academia specifically?
I think there are many forms, both obvious and not so obvious forms of spirit murder. And I think Gabe and I came together. We didn't even know what we were experiencing individually and collectively had a name until we saw the call for this special issue journal. And we sort of texted each other immediately like, oh, this is it. This is what we were feeling, right? And so I think it's many things, Marlon. I think it's a feeling of exhaustion, extreme exhaustion. It is questioning one's self, one's sanity, one's work, one's place in academia, one's value, one's worth. It's being taxed to the point of no return in many ways, right? Those are some of the immediate feelings that come to mind. But it's not only feelings, right? It's also observing that you're being treated in a very, very, very different way than other colleagues who are not racially minoritized, right? It's being tokenized as well. It's being assigned the person who fixes everything related to diversity or equity or inclusion, justice. It's being rejected by journals who question if your research is credible or rigorous. It's being told that your work is me search because it focuses on you, right? Those are just some things that come to mind right away.
And I would add to that, it also happens multiple times, right? I think that's part of it, is that it's not just one isolated incident, but it's a buildup of incidents that combine together, right? It has this huge impact on your body and on your soul. For instance, when you asked the question, I immediately thought about in one of my graduate programs, I would walk around campus and I would have cops called on me. I would have instances of people coming up to me and speaking Spanish, just assuming, right? And I do speak it, so it's not like they're not wrong, right? In that I speak it, but it's the assumption that because you look a certain way, you must have access to this language. And that also hurts people who may look like me and don't have access to that language, right? Because they go down a spiral of they're not Latino enough or they're not Mexican enough. And that in itself is also hurtful. But then you go to the classroom and you have people telling you that racism doesn't exist. And I always think about a quote from a poem from Teresa Sierratonu, and she says, "You can't claim racism doesn't exist if you don't know what it means to survive it." And in a lot of my courses in graduate school, there would be instances where people would say, well, it's not real anymore because people aren't being lynched, people aren't being deported. And it's like, actually, this is still happening, right? And we have evidence now because there's recordings and there's social media, and people still woefully will say that it is not real. And so you have this battle, right, of you walking on campus, having the cops called on you, and then in the classroom, people telling you that didn't happen. It's a form of gaslighting, and combined, it really does murder your spirit, right? It's these collection of incidents.
Yeah, I would add to that, in addition to what Gabe just said, it's compounded in that you experience those things. You are assumed to be the admin assistant and not the professor, which is something that always happens to me. The disrespect that is sort of easily given, effortlessly placed on you. But then there's also the very real trauma that comes with trying to get tenure, right? So doing this type of work and trying to have your work published in journals that are considered high impact, right? It's having reviewers who are not culturally competent or who understand issues of isms, really, not just racism, any kind of isms, talk about your work in ways that are just simply not constructive, right? They gatekeep where your work can go. But yet you're held to these metrics of success by these institutions that weren't built for people like us and don't necessarily serve people like us, right? So it's this compounded effect that Gabe alludes to that you can never really escape from.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. As you talk about this, and I think of my experiences. I also think about an article that I read in NPR about weathering, just to kind of abbreviate what weathering is and reference a bit more about it. Weathering, this is, essentially comes from this hypothesis posing that the accumulation of racial stresses over a period of time induces lower health, worse health, as well as birth outcomes for Black women. To be a little bit more detailed, it's by a lifetime of discrimination, Black women age earlier and faster. Researchers theorize that this accelerated health deteriorates because of accumulative exposure to racial-based stressors in a race-conscious society that we live in. Would you say that this is comparable to your concept of spirit murdering in academia and just how it then affects individuals across the board of color?
Yeah, I mean, I see tons of intersections with weathering, and weathering is new to me, Chris. So I appreciate you in my attention to it. I think in many ways it's very, very similar to spirit murdering. Gabe, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would say based on your description, I mean, it's spot on in that they are both conceptualized by Black women, right? Spirit murdering is also conceptualized by a Black woman. And so it speaks to that. And I don't want to get ahead of the questions, but it does speak to Black feminist theory, specifically standpoint, right? In that it's this idea that if it's happening enough to enough Black women, they develop a standpoint. They develop a point of view that is unique to them, right? It's a collective understanding that, oh, you're also experiencing this? Okay, me too, right? And with Black feminist theory and standpoint, it also encourages other folks to also come up with their own standpoint. But I'm always very grateful for Black feminist theory because it allows for a lot of coalition building, right, in the classroom and outside of it, which I think my understanding of it is especially was helpful for just being there for faculty of color in general in all of my graduate experiences, but specifically for understanding when instances like that occurred in the classroom. So when going back to your question, is it similar? Absolutely, right? Because I knew that, I mean, if you just look around, right, to see why aren't schools retaining Black women, right? Why are health risks associated with just being in academia, right? These are things that we know to be true and that there has been plenty of studies on. So I would say it's absolutely similar. Again, I'd have to read a little bit more on it, but it's definitely spot on in terms of the health disparities that are associated with it and also how it impacts Black women for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, just to kind of add to what you've just said and, comment a bit, I too as a visual artist, reference Black feminist thoughts in my research in grad school, completing my thesis. It was a great way of really conceptualize what I was doing visually. And I mean, yes, I too commend and really respect highly how it has been able to really, for lack of a better word, validate our experiences. Yeah. And I guess I would then, for the question around how Black feminist thought has really supported the framework of spirit murdering for you, Raquel. I know Gabriel just shared a bit in his thought.
Yeah, no, I mean, very similar to Gabe. And we went back and forth about, we sort of immediately thought about, as we were talking through frameworks to anchor this in, it was almost immediate and necessary that we include Black feminist thought, because it serves as a foundation for our entry point to this work, and we know that Black women are typically not credited across the board, not just in academe, right? Certainly, it concretized my experiences with spirit murdering and some of the consequences of just staying in academe. And I've written extensively about this, and tying it back, Chris, to what you said about health outcomes. I wrote a piece with another faculty member. She is not Black, but identifies with the queer community. And we just talked about our journey through academe and how that has impacted our health significantly, right? There's very little scholarship on it, but we're starting to now not only talk about it, but anchor it in the research, right? Because, as Gabe alludes to, recognizing these standpoints, that they're no longer just individual one-off stories. They're collaborative stories shared by many, 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 many Black women. So as we embarked on this, and in many ways, and we say this in the piece, Gabe and I had been writing this piece for many years in our head, in our conversations with each other. This piece came together, I would say, very effortlessly, very seamlessly, very easy, because we just kind of dumped everything that was in our head onto paper. And recognizing that even the term spirit murder came from a Black woman, right? And so really intersecting that with Black feminist thought was appropriate, given our individual experiences or collective experiences and the notion of spirit murdering.
Just for the listeners to get a little bit more understanding on what is standpoint theory, could you give a little bit of an abbreviated definition on what that is?
Yeah, so it comes from feminism, and it essentially, right, is saying that it's another word for social location, right? And so your identities have an influence on how you're going to experience life. That's the quick and brief, right? But I definitely recommend folks to look more into it and to read. But when we used Black feminist standpoint theory, specifically because it accounts for the things that I wouldn't experience, right? Because I'm not a Black woman. And so it made sense to use that, because even though I experienced racism, I know that that's a microcosm of anti-Blackness. It's inherent, it's tied, it's connected. And so even though I'm not Black, I know that it's an offshoot, right? Racism doesn't just exist. It's not just something that it's a direct descendant of anti-Blackness, right? Slavery. And so it made a lot of sense, because if I didn't have that shared Black feminist standpoint with Dr. Wright-Mair, then I wouldn't be able to see how she's being targeted in academia, right? You have to have an understanding of where someone is to know how they're being targeted. And so that's why I think for both of us, it made sense at the time when we were writing it, because we can clearly see, right? Okay, so it's not just that you are Black. It's not just that you are a woman. It's not just that you are Black and a woman. It's also that you're an immigrant. It's also that you are on your first year of the tenure track, right? So all of these components, right, built up a standpoint for Dr. Wright-Mair to be able to see, okay, these are the multiple things that are coming at me. And for me too, right, as someone who was in the classroom, it also puts me at target if I vocalize, well, okay, now all of a sudden it's favoritism to students of color, when that's not what's going on at all. It would just be me saying like, oh, what you're doing is actually anti-Black as hell, because this is why you're doing it with only the Black professor, the only Black woman professor in the entire department, right? When you're able to name things, it severely scares individuals, because all of a sudden it's no longer a thought or an idea, but it's actually an action that you're able to name. And that's why it's so helpful to pair these two together, right? Because if we didn't have a Black feminist standpoint, then we wouldn't acknowledge the spirit murder that's occurring, right? But together, you're able to really see a holistic picture. You really can't have them. They're inseparable for us in a lot of ways.
Got it.
Got it. Well, you guys did the work that you guys are doing, as well as the work that you guys have done, so encapsulated and provided so much needed further explanation and definition and language to what people with these identities experience, right? But I also want to speak on safe spaces, right? Now that we've identified the problem, can we identify spaces where you may be protected from spirit murdering? So one piece in the beginning of your article that sticks out to me in particular was when it stated how minoritized faculty and students have to navigate constant attacks on their minds, bodies, and spirits as they navigate an academy not intended for them in the first place. So in your research, have you found institutions or academic programs that protect minoritized students and or faculty from spirit murdering?
So Marlon, when I hear that question, my immediate reaction to that is it's not the institution and it's not the academic program. Mm-hmm. It's people who care, who occupy these spaces, mm-hmm. right? And it's something I really make a note in my publications, in my research, to name that. Because I think the default is, oh yeah, our institution can change. The people, what we're really calling for is for people within these institutions to change, right? Certainly in my faculty experience, the people who have supported me, protected me, poured into me have made all the difference, right? I would say the same about students. It's who is looking out for that student, right? Institutions of higher education were not built for people like myself and Gabe, right? The institution is operating the way it was intended to. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's the people who actually care about us or identities or experiences or sustainability, right? Who help to move us through these periods where we are experiencing this.
Got it. And that also makes me think about health as well. In your research, have you found any research showing a difference in overall health between students who've endured the stress of spirit murdering and from the people in these institutions not intended for their success, and students who have gotten the support they needed post-grad?
I can briefly start us off. Yes, to answer your question, yes, there is a difference, and policies do make a difference. I wholeheartedly agree with Dr. Wright-Mair that it's ultimately people that we're calling for, right, and that can actually make real change in students' lives. But even with the policies, right, it takes individuals that write these policies to make campus more welcoming and even better, more affirming to students. And so as you mentioned, one of my areas of research is queer and trans populations, right? Collegians, broadly speaking. And yes, the research shows that having gender affirming restrooms, locker rooms, places to sleep, right? Dorm rooms, I know that's the outdated term. Nonetheless, having housing that's affirming to students is really helpful. There's one article that I think of, Steelman, 2017, I think. And in it, they say that suicidality largely decreases when students are affirmed, right, with their gender in multitude of ways, right? Locker rooms, restrooms, housing. etc. But it can't stop there, because that's just one aspect, right? But what other programming are institutions doing to continue that affirmation, right? Because just as there is those moments of affirmations with restrooms, with locker rooms, there's plenty of moments where students are unaffirmed and are constantly attacked outside of that, right? A restroom is not going to be your only safe space on campus. It can't be, and it shouldn't be. And it shouldn't be the only signal to queer and trans students that they belong and that they're welcomed and that they will be affirmed on campus, right? There also has to be a talk the talk, right? To go back to your last question, Marlon, academic programs, again, tying it back to what Dr. Wright-Mair said, it's the individuals, right? Because for me, in my experiences, even though my degree is in higher education, I did a lot of courses, over 10, which is more than I would say 2/3 of my degree, in African American and diaspora studies and women's gender and sexuality studies. And that was for very specific reasons. My home department couldn't push me further, right? I had learned from top people in my field, I consider, during my master's program. And so I needed to challenge myself, and this was the way that I could, right? And I was fortunate, because not in every program will you have people who are going to affirm you and who are going to say you do belong here, which was one of my biggest kind of nerves was, should I be in Black feminist thought courses? Because there's multiple that I took, right? And there was just feminist courses in general, I would say, broadly speaking, that I'd enroll in. And there's one professor, Dr. Anne-Marie Mingo, who would always say, you belong here and you're doing the work and you're invested. This is not just I want to use these theories for my research and I don't care about Black women, right? I know that that's not you, and you belong here. And it's moments like that affirm you and can be affirming. But again, it goes back to not necessarily institutions or programs, but the individuals occupying those spaces.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I guess, to piggyback off what you have said, it makes me now consider how is then, because you just shared how much more work you pushed yourself to do to even be even more informed than more so what maybe have been necessary, but what you felt was important to validate the thoughts in which you and experiences that you wanted to discuss. How then is productivity to meet the academic metrics required of a program? How is an institution then able to really gauge this? How is one's productivity, I guess, really being measured?
It's a great question, and one I ask all the time, right? Because in my experience, for example, in my first tenure track position, I was operating from a mega deficit. I was spread so thin that I would not even have anything left for my own self, right? So when you ask that question, it's an easy answer. I wasn't productive for my first 2 years on the tenure track, not because I didn't want to, not because I didn't win dissertation of the year before, a national award in my field. I could not. I had zero capacity to be productive. Productive for me was being able to show up in the classroom, teach, and make it back home alive. Right. So, the trauma, the murdered spirit, in many ways, I see it as a tailspin, right? Where you just continue down this deep, dark hole, because here are the metrics looming over one's head. I need to publish. I need to engage in research. At that point, my dissertation was sitting down pretty, had just won an award. And there was, I just didn't even have the time to think. I had no time to conceptualize how I would take important, amazing, groundbreaking work and actually turn it into something. And to be quite frank, I would think about conceptualizing the idea and I was already exhausted. Right? And I speak openly about this experience, not just to my own doctoral students, at conferences, to colleagues, to junior faculty. Now that I am tenured, I share my story because I don't think that we normalize these stories in higher ed, right? I normalize going from 0 to 100 real quick, but operating from a place of deficit and questioning and imposter syndrome looming, right? When I moved to an institution that provided support mechanisms, and I, always come back to the dean who hired me, who was a Black woman, an incredible Black woman who I think was the first person to feel, recognize, and see my murdered spirit. And I remember when I interviewed with her, and I'm still very in touch with her. We have a wonderful relationship. She is great. And every success that I have gotten recently or over the last few years, I always come back. I always say to her, are your ears ringing? I talk about her all the time. I text her, I credit her. I say, you gave me this chance to be my brilliant self. But I remember during her interview, she closed the CV and she said to me, okay, Miss Raquel, so tell me what's really going on. And I remember pausing when she asked me that question, and I was like, is she for real or is this a trick? And again, that's the product of spirit murder. And you always kind of questioning and wondering and expecting the worst. That's all times, right? And
so is it safe to say there's a little paranoia that develops?
Absolutely. And Gabe knows this story well, right? Because Gabe was my GA and my graduate student at the time. Gabe knew I was aggressively on the market, trying to find somewhere else. I had gone through so much that year, just so much. And I finally got to this point where I just immediately felt this connection with this woman. And she closed the CV and she said to me, tell me what's really going on. And I just paused. And in that 30 seconds, I quickly thought, well, I have nothing to lose. Regardless of what I say, the truth or a lie, she's either going to know I'm lying or see through me, or she's going to give me a chance. And I think she saw my hesitation because I'm a very strong interviewer. I, kind of ebb and flow, and there's not much silence from me in an interview, right? And I think she picked up on the pause and she said to me, I've been there before. I've been in a hostile environment, but I want to understand why, as a second-year faculty, you are chairing 10 dissertations. And I remember looking at her and I remember thinking, she saw it. She was the first dean who didn't focus on, wow, you don't have any publications or you have a book chapter and that's it. She immediately pivoted and said, I don't care that you don't have publications. Why are you on 10 dissertation committees chairing them 1 year out of grad school? And it opened up this fruitful conversation where I could say to her, yeah, I've been asking the same question as well. Like, I haven't had the opportunity to really engage in my own research or take a chance on myself because I haven't been given one. And it just led to a beautiful relationship from that point, and her saying, what would you need to thrive in an ideal job? What would you need? And, I'm happy to say that I was given everything and more to thrive, and thrive I have, right?
I didn't know that interviewers ask that question.
Well, I think when you care about people and when you care about transformation, and going back to your question, when you care about supporting those of us with racially minoritized identities, you need to ask those questions. Right? And I think in many ways, I always say to her, you're kind of textbook for what all deans should be, or all hiring managers, right? You see through the BS. And so I found myself in an environment where for once I could think. I had a low class load. I had research support. I had assistance. I had research startup funds. I could travel to conferences. Interdisciplinary work was, celebrated. I had colleagues who were amazing. I'm like, what? They're not.
Here we are, colleagues that are
exactly, Chris. Exactly. That's a perfect example. But
exactly,
Chris and I aren't even in the same department, the same school, not even.
Exactly.
And so I immediately was brought into this world that in many ways forced joy, because I could now start to find joy. And the
Can you repeat that? Forced joy. Could you just repeat that for the
I,
listeners?
I was forced to sit in joy for the first time, and to find joy and to celebrate joy and to be joy. And who I am now and who I've been for the last 4.5 years is completely different from the 2 years I started out on the tenure track, right? So in a couple of weeks, I'm presenting at a conference, and I jumped. When I tell you, I jumped at the opportunity when I was asked to present on what's the topic here? I'm going to actually tell you because I just got an email about it. I want to read the actual, like, just summarize it. I'm going to be focusing on academic publishing demystified, and moving through imposter syndrome as a racially minoritized, faculty member. And I jumped on it because I think it's really easy to see what's there now. The metrics, like, oh my goodness, she's so well published, and you have all these articles and a book and da. And I always, 10 times out of 10, and Gabe can back me up because he's not with me 24/7, but he's heard me. I always say, when I started out on my academic journey, I had nothing. Everything you see now has been done in 4 years. And to be able to be that productive in 4 years means that you have been given solid support infrastructure, and you have people who invest in you and care about you and want to see you thrive, not just survive.
Yes. And I want to hear Gabe's story as well. Gabe, I would love to hear, how do you, I guess to rephrase the question, what does productivity look like for you, and what do you need? What have you lacked, and how has your experience been, in contrast as a student, similar to Raquel?
Yeah, I would say that when it comes to teaching, I've had many opportunities to either come in either as a graduate assistant or as a on my own, right, to teach my own courses. And so I'm very grateful in that aspect, right? And it always, really, my answer is always going to come back to community, right? Because I have people who have seen me in their classrooms and then say, you should TA for me, or will you TA for me? And that in itself is such a compliment, because it's saying that you're trusting someone in your sacred space to be able to come in, either join you or just guest lecture and just take over, right? To run the show for one day. That's the biggest honor that anyone can afford me. But when it comes to writing, similar. Writing is deeply spiritual for me, because I started, as I said, as a poet. And so that my feelings have always been attached to my writing. And I feel like everyone should, right? There's this idea that our writing needs to be detached, or that needs to be objective. And it should, right, in some capacity, right? But at the same time, it's also very subjective in that I can't leave my identities or my experiences at the door. I have to bring them with me, and that brings emotion, and I'm going to show it, because it shows that I care, right? I can't do this without community. I can't, right? People have put a lot of effort and energy into showing me the ways that you are supposed to go about it, right? I can think back to the most recent example. It was the first submission that I had done to a journal specifically. And one of my mentors literally sat with me on Zoom and went instruction by instruction on how to submit, which is wild.
Wow.
Like, that shouldn't be a thing. If people want to publish, they should be able to easily navigate a system. But no, I had to have someone who has been in the game for, I don't know, like 5 years, who is about to be tenured or just got tenured, I think. And it's frustrating. Like, that in itself is frustrating, that I'm very grateful that someone took time to walk me down. Like, we were literally on Zoom for an hour and just going through the website and click that, and don't forget to click that, because if you don't click that, you're going to be charged $600. And it's like, that's not transparent, right? It's not clear. It's not easily to navigate. And those are some of the barriers that prevent people from publishing. It's not the writing, right? We know that communities of color, queer and trans communities have strong writers, right? There's a long lineage of history that shows that. But when it comes to publishing, and publishing in some journals, there's a lot of gatekeeping that we don't really address, right? Such as website navigation. Because how are you supposed to publish if you can't even navigate the website? And then the reviewers and how to address them, that's also in its own separate entity for how to play the game, right? Shout out to Dr. Wright-Mair's article about playing the game. But it's all interconnected with community and productivity. I can only be as productive if I'm good, and I'm not good if my community isn't good, and it's a trickle down.
I do want to add just one thing here, Chris, Marlon, Gabe. The experience that I just talked about, I connect that so intricately to that notion of community, right? Because I think to be in community with others means that you see yourself and your pain in others. And I think the fact that dean saw that in me, she read between the lines because she'd been there.
Right.
She had also had a murdered spirit. And so through community, we can also help to pave the way for others through shared experiences and, quite frankly, shared pain.
Definitely. So now that we're in this space where on a macro level, these spaces are at threat of being dissolved, in your guys' opinion, how does this new legislation impact and in many ways set back social justice efforts, especially by scholars who have spent so much of their academic and personal life committed to advancing these and other efforts?
Thinking about affirmative action.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't see it that way. I don't see it as a setback. I think that when you have spaces, right? And I always think back to ethnic studies because that's where my academic home lies. In undergrad, I did a double major in ethnic studies, right? It wasn't just Latin American Latino studies, it was critical race and ethnic studies too. And we were taught very early that those weren't given to us, right? People fought for it. And even though there might be legislation to try to restrict what is being taught in those spaces, and even in higher ed, right? Whenever we talk about CRT, it's not a setback because people that are invested in social justice are always going to be invested in social justice and already anticipate these attacks happening, right? So if you stay ready, you don't have to get ready, is my mentality with it. And it can also discredit the years of work that people have done, right? To say that all of Bell Hook's writings is going to be set back by some racist in Texas or Pennsylvania or California, I think not. Sorry, I think not. Bell Hooks worked too hard for that to be the setback that sets us back, right? If anything, it's like we need to be in community with one another to bring that back. It's so important because it frustrates me because I saw it, right? There was a lot of legislation written to ban abortions. And then all of a sudden it was a banning of drag artistry. And then, but if you have been paying attention, it really started in Arizona with SB 1070 and the ban on ethnic studies. It's been happening, but it's the fact that people are not coalition building, because if we protected one another, we wouldn't get this far. And it's a domino impact, right? Because they think that, oh, that's not a me issue, it's a them issue. And for me, it was very, very frustrating to see the ban on drag artistry, really gender identity, when you read it and see how it's being applied, and to see the community of white, queer, trans individuals all of a sudden care. And it's like, where were you when they were banning abortion? Where were you when they were banning CRT, when they were banning diversity and equity? Why were you not paying attention to those? Because hello, you are diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? We're all connected. Our struggles are interconnected. So if we pay attention to these domino effects, we wouldn't be this far. But to answer the question, I think if we stay ready, we don't have to get ready. And for those of us who have stayed ready, it's like the bump in the road. We know we're going to overcome it. It's just a matter of how.
And I love that reframe too, because this discussion, it feels like in a broader level, the narrative is to induce fear. But what you're saying is that you're giving more context to there's hope by identifying the army, the generations of armies that have been fighting for this and that have been, what I love what you said, that have already in some ways prepared for this moment to fight back and to not fight back, but push back against these policies?
I think in terms of impact, if I could just add to what Gabe just brilliantly stated, I think in terms of impact, though, when you talk about the connection with spirit murdering, it's like you can never get a break. Here we go again. All right. So more pain and attacks to navigate through. I think it certainly makes the work difficult, right? But for those of us invested in this work, we know that there's no easy way out. We know that we continuously have to talk the talk and walk the walk and continue to have these conversations with admissions officers, right? With people who occupy these educational spaces. My graduate students, for example, when the legislation was passed, we had conversations around, okay, well, how can we sort of creatively go around this? How are we using our brains or understanding of theories, lived experiences, etc., to navigate these treacherous terrains? And I think Gabe is right. We saw the writing on the wall. So I agree with Gabe, hands down. I do think the impact, though, is that we continue to have murdered souls across academia, right? Across higher education, not just for faculty, but also for administrators.
It sounds to me like you're saying that we even more so now have to really, as Gabe put it, rely on our community and our coalitions to continue to build not only understanding but also action to keep things moving forward, because bringing in spirit murdering is just another attack to keep us disillusioned and discouraged to continue.
And broken too, right? Again, I said it earlier, the system is operating the way it was intended, right? So if we hold that at the core, we know that this is calculated. This is part of the plan for brokenness to ensue.
Absolutely. Thinking a little bit more about your article and spirit murdering and its intersection with affirmative action, what do you feel at this point is poignant and pivotal for the incoming students to consider that maybe not yet, doesn't yet have a community? How do we then support them in their journey as they come into this space that, like we said, it's not designed for them, and they're now potentially navigating without being tapped into a community just yet?
I think that's a really good question, Chris. I have a few thoughts here. My knee-jerk reaction to that is, and I want to clarify here, you're speaking about racially minoritized students, yes?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, I mean, those of us who've been in these walls of academia, all of us here on this call, know what it's like to occupy these spaces and navigate these journeys, right? I don't think that experience is going to change much. It's going to continue to be difficult, right? We're going to have to find those mentors, those friendtors, those colleagues, those people who care to continue to pour into us, right? Does it require additional work on our part as faculty? Certainly. But again, I don't see this as being new. I think it's a new attack. But really, is it very different from what students of color experienced 10 years ago, 20 years ago? Certainly the nuances, right? Certainly the nuances. But I think the experiences are very, very similar and call upon each other to pour in and continue doing what we've been doing this entire time.
I was just going to add, and I'll be very curious to see what new excuse folks will come up with to see why people of color are present on campus when they can't blame affirmative action for our presence. What's going to be the new excuse, right, to speak to this? Because my entire career in all of the schools that I've been to, there's been an individual or two or four who have said, oh, well, you're a person of color, so it's easier for you to get into the school or to get scholarships or to get access to money. And it's never because I'm brilliant, right? It's always because of your color, your skin tone. And we know that there's a lot more than just affirmative action that goes into admissions, but for folks who lack understanding or who are woefully ignorant, You know what I mean? There's really no excuse. And so I'm curious to see what new reasoning they'll come up with.
I always like to say, Chris, the work continues. And really, that's how I wanted to answer your question. But I know you wanted me to say more, right? But it sounds so simple and rudimentary, but the work continues. Those invested in advancing justice work know that the work continues.
Sure. I'm kind of also responding to what you've said and what I'm thinking. So I reframed a question that is where I said, let's talk a bit more about money. And so I am referring to what do you see is the opportunity lost in the areas of funding, grants, donors, when it comes to how, not having affirmative action, thinking about spirit murdering and how it now will impact both students and faculty?
So, I'm thinking about the anti-CRT legislation, right? I was just talking to a friend this morning who is being directly affected by this, is in a high-level administrative position and now has to pivot, right? It's in a state that just passed a law where you cannot use race, gender identity, sexual orientation, and now it becomes complex to put your money where your mouth is, right? So when I hear you ask that question, I think one of the opportunity losses here certainly is continuing to back programs that have, for the last 20 years, or more or less, made a difference in so many people's lives, right? So cultural centers, Gabe mentioned that earlier in our call. Cultural centers, for example, have been a place that many students of color find refuge, right? In navigating predominantly white spaces. Special programs, events, initiatives, though we know that supporting students are not just limited to a one-off event or an annual program, that sort of thing. Being able to have money to fund those initiatives is important, right? Of course, there's always low-hanging fruits and things you can do without money, but we know that economic factors drive major transformation. And so I'd be remiss to say that, there isn't going to be a major loss here and a major impact. But the conversation I had with one of my friends this morning was, okay, well, what's the loophole here, right? And I think it goes back to Gabe's.
There's always a loophole.
Yes, there's always a loophole. And we started engaging in conversation about, all right, so a center that has been, I don't know, named something like the Center for Advancing Social Justice and DEI, let's just say, right? Could that be renamed Center for the Engagement of Civil Discourse? So I found a loophole in that I've passed through your legislative barriers of not being able to use these specific targeted words. But now I'm coming up with something that is speaking to a tenet of your legislation, which is saying, the purpose of our legislation is to prevent anything that has to do with DEI because you are not encouraging civil discourse. Okay, cool. Well, how about we have a center that focuses on civil discourse? We're getting straight at one of your major concerns, right?
Yes. I love
the
that.
work around there. And so I think, again, yes, obviously, it's going to impact what many institutions, particularly like ethnic studies programs, student affairs, departments, that sort of thing. Certainly, there is going to be loss, but I also think there is opportunity in that.
And I think that speaks to the history of minoritized people's ability of cunning reimagining in order to survive. And by you stating what you just said, it's recognizing that within this whole equation, right? In spite of this policy being put in place, minoritized people also have a history of navigating through that in order to get to where they need to be. So I love that.
I'd like to first also hear what Gabe's thoughts on the impacts in regards to funding and such, thinking about yourself as a creative, an individual that's a writer of poetry. What opportunities or impact loss do you see for yourself and others that, coming from so close to the space of coming out of being a student?
Yeah, I mean, it's another stepping stone for sure in terms of how we're going to navigate and how to move forward. But I do like Marlon's terminology about this reimagining space, right? That it presents us with, and that Dr. Wright-Mair spoke of. My doctoral advisor, Dr. Wilson Okello, would refer to it as Black refusal. I was very fortunate to TA a course for him. And the difference between refusal and resistance is that resistance, you're constantly engaging with what's in front of you. Whereas refusal, you're not even acknowledging it, right? You're moving away from it. You're not engaging with that kind of metric. And so that's kind of where I'm seeing my entrance to the conversation is refusing it, right? And obviously not ignoring it, because you can't. Like Dr. Wright-Mair said, it's going to impact. There's going to be an impact. But how can I engage with this, or rather, how do I not engage with this in a way that still allows me to do the work that I want to do? To your point, Krystle, right? Especially when it comes to my creative energy and into my creativity, right? Because that's very separate. Though folks will link it to my academic writing, it's very separate from it. And I'm going to write what I want to write when it comes to poems and things like that, right? But it might make my academic writing a little bit more trickier for navigating those spaces, or not, depending on how I move about it and where the law kind of orients us. But again, there's always spaces to not engage, right? And I don't say that to say that we ignore the problems, right? But again, going back to this idea of refusal, of how do we move forward with a different reimagining, right?
I love that, because a few episodes back, one of the advice we gave to MFA grad students in critique, when they get a critique that is not really useful to the discourse that they would like their artwork being placed in, is to pivot and refuse to engage. Respectfully, but refuse to engage because it really isn't relevant to what you're interested in. I think that's a beautiful way to go about still being impactful in regards to the work that you are doing. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah,
Chris,
It goes back.
I was just saying, I have a great example of that. I have a paper that I wrote with two very dear colleagues and friends about our experience as Jamaican women in the academy, and it's very close to being accepted. And I got it back, and one of the reviewers said that the use of we and our, now this is critical collaborative ethnography, right?
Yes.
We use a Caribbean methodology in this, or Caribbean method rather, of groundings. You might know Walter Rodney's groundings, which requires you to center self and community. We just wrote a 40-page paper that you have read, and your review to me is going to be the use of we and our makes this paper very elementary in its presentation, which is really interesting because reviewer 2 ranted and raved about the brilliance and the blessing of this paper to the scholarship. And so I wrote a letter to the editor, and I said, we are 3 tenured professors who are critical scholars. This was not a mistake. This was actually intentional. And I would like your support in pushing back against this reviewer's request for us to change, because how do we define academic worthiness? It's a paper on post-colonialism, right? And its impact. Yes, you're sitting here with these very imperialist ideas of how you deem rigorous, rigid, and worthy academic writing. I refuse to engage in that. Absolutely not.
Lord. I feel you on that one. I have those experiences myself. But anyways, Marlon, take us home.
Yes, yes. Well, one thing I want to point out is, or I want to add to that discussion in the fine arts world, when talking about one's work, a popular term that I found, a way for artists to pivot the conversation is simply by saying, I'm not interested in that conversation. And I also love to use that term. I've also adapted that term as well when conversations about my work have gone in a direction that it didn't need to go to, and it wasn't supposed to go to. So, but yeah, to close out, and you guys talked about this throughout our discussion a lot, but I really want you guys to double down, or I want to give you guys the opportunity to double down on this particular topic, and that being community, right? So toward the end of your article, you talked about how you both try best to support one another. And Chris and I can relate to that really deeply and closely, because during our time as MFA students, we were in the same cohort together. So we were through the trenches from day one. But as MFA students, we really learned on or leaned on each other to safely unpack what we were experiencing and helped each other navigate through that. So can you guys just speak a little bit more on how affirmative action helped organically and institutionally build that community of support in these academic spaces?
I can start for sure. So we who study higher ed always understand universities, colleges, institutions of higher learning to be microcosms of the real world, right? And so you can't have, it's essentially a mirror, right? And you can't have a mirror of, at the time, it was mostly white men, right? Majority. And so when we look back at who benefited early on from affirmative action, it was white women. And then it was people of color, right? And so I mentioned that to speak to the fact that it's making institutions more realistic to what is happening in the quote unquote real world, right? You're not just going to have white men in these spaces, and it's making it more realistic is kind of the point that I want to drive home. And by opening up access, not only is it making it more realistic, but it's leveling out the field, right? Because we know that historically there's been a lot of barriers put in place for women, for people of color, for queer and trans individuals, and folks who are living in the intersections as well.
I mean, I'm not sure I would have anything else to add to that. We know without a doubt that affirmative action has had an impact on access. Bringing people who the university was not built for into the doors to break these barriers, contribute to more richness. Gabe said it well. I'm not sure that there's anything else I would have to add to that.
Awesome.
Okay. Thank you so much, Gabriel, as well as Raquel, for your input and for this discussion. I just wanted to take a moment to congratulate you on your recent grant and hear a little bit more about it. Could you share a little bit on what is going on and what you're going to do and all the niceness that you're going to talk about and all the research you're going to build? Tell us.
I am very, very happy to be supported by a research team of amazing humans who I love. Dr. Candice Peters, Dr. Gabriel Pulido, Dr. Brian Hubane, and we will be studying niceness culture in academia. We're excited to engage in this work. We're still a couple months out, but stay tuned. Stay tuned for some amazing discoveries that I have no doubt will come from this engagement. So,
is it appropriate for you to share what the name of the grant is, what the funding look like? Is that appropriate?
Well, I'll just say it is being supported by the Spencer Foundation. We'll leave it at that for now.
All right. Big names. Well, congratulations to you both. Your work, I truly respect it. I truly see how it connects to visual artists and how they navigate academia, using it as a bit of caution as to what you may experience. Maybe you may not, and that would be wonderful. But if you do, here's what it could look like. And, I'm so very happy to have researchers like you in education that is paving the way on these social issues, utilizing your personal experiences, each other's stories, identities, and all that you think of creatively to help us grow as not only educators, but, make these institutions do better. So thank you.
Yes. Raquel, Dr. Gabriel, thank you for your light. Thank you for your work. Thank you for your research. Thank you for adding language to what generations of people have been feeling, and adding context to that and placing that in the conversations within the hallowed halls of academe. Wish you nothing but the best. And thank you also for your time and your voice today, and helping and sharing your expertise on this subject matter. So thank you so much, and eternally grateful for helping us round out this conversation.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for the invitation. I really, I know I appreciated this conversation, and also for you, both Marlon and Chris, for creating this modality, and this space for engagement. It's certainly very important. I love podcasts. So I'm always happy to collaborate with amazing people on these endeavors. So thank you for having us.
I echo everything Dr. Wright-Mair said. Thank you. It's really powerful to see a podcast like this in existence. I think it does a lot of good work, and it keeps the conversations going. And I will definitely circle back to both of you, as one day I hope to pursue my MFA too. So shout out to you.
All right.
Check in. All right.
Yes. Awesome.
And that's a wrap.
Thank you again. Now we're at the point of the show where we want to hear from you, the listeners. Join us on Discord, the link found in our show description, to share your thoughts on these two questions. 1, how have you experienced spirit murdering in your academic pursuits? And 2, how have you navigated through them?
Thank you for listening to our episode. The Hidden Critique is produced and hosted by us, Krystle and Marlon Tobias. Episodes are edited by Kirsten Pettifor. Original music composed by Cesar Presa.
If you like the show, you can review and rate this podcast via Spotify or Apple Podcasts. You can also like, subscribe, and comment on our YouTube page.
For exclusive bonus content, subscribe to our Patreon at The Hidden Critique.
Or join the Hidden Critiques Discord page to engage directly with us, the host, and build community with fellow listeners.